Hi there, this is Dave, and I'm here today to talk about Jack Benny's Maxwell. It is the most famous Maxwell, although there have been distinguished Maxwells, because early Maxwell cars were among the first to climb Mount Washington without a problem, to cross the country, the first car driven by a woman across the country. It was a big deal back in those days at the turn of the century. So the Maxwell came about in 1904. The original Maxwell was very successful and the company might have gone on into the present day. Basically, it was a good car, but once Chrysler took over Maxwell Motors and had his Chrysler come out in early 1924, making it a century of Chrysler, as shown in my book, Century of Chrysler. Once that happened, they eventually brought the Maxwell brand into Chrysler. It became the Chrysler 4, and from there on in, Maxwell was dead. So Jack Benny hit the radio in 1932. Maxwell had been a very popular brand up to around 1925. There were still Maxwells around. These were cars that you would laugh at the owners of, but it would be like a Dodge Caliber among the Mopar crowd. So this, or a Toyota Echo, a broken down old Toyota Echo, you would imagine somebody who's really, really cheap still owning one of those because he doesn't want to get rid of it because a new car is just too expensive. So that is the role that the Maxwell had to play, and that's why Jack Benny chose it on his radio show, because he was just starting to play a skinflint. He started out as a suave master of ceremonies with some self-deprecating humor, and he ended up playing a skinflint. Now, what they realized once they were on set, the first time that the Maxwell showed up, is that the sound effects man did not have a recording of an old car, Maxwell or other. So Mel Blanc, who was there, volunteered to do impressions of it, and he did the car coughing and sputtering, and it was so popular that the Maxwell, played by Mel Blanc, kept coming on and again and again and again. And the problem with this, of course, ended up when they went on to television and into movies, that they didn't actually have a Jack Benny Maxwell. So they had to go out and buy one. When I went out to look for an old script involving the radio show and the Maxwell, I found a little bit of dialogue, including Jack Benny saying that he'd been thinking of getting a new car, but he didn't know what kind he'd like. And Rochester says, "Why don't you get one of those new Hudsons? They're so streamlined. They're so low you step down into them." And the reason for that little ad was apparent with the next two lines. Jack Benny says, "Well, you step down into this car." And Rochester said, "I know, but the Hudson has a floor." Hudson famously had the step-down design at that point. It was a very nice car, unibody before its time. So it was low slung, giving it very good handling, but there was plenty of room for you and your hat once you got inside because the floor was lowered, because it wasn't body on frame and you could do that. Now, Jack Benny's show continued for decades. So certainly by the 1960s, when the Maxwell was still a joke on the Jack Benny show on television, people didn't think of old Maxwells as old beaters that you still drove around. It would be like somebody today driving a 1955 Chevy. It's like, well, yeah, now that's a classic car. Even a Valiant today, you see them, you don't think, now there's somebody who's just cheap and refusing to upgrade his car. You think, now there's somebody who's restored a classic car, or who's bought a classic car and is going to restore it. So the joke really wouldn't work if people didn't know Jack Benny so well. And Jack Benny really was a big celebrity for quite a lot of his career. He was a very famous comedian, and all America knew who he was and knew what he was like, even if they never watched or listened to any of his shows. The car that they gave Jack Benny as a Maxwell example is not one of the 1925 models, which was the most recent, but a 1907, which, even when they gave it to him, would have been more of a classic car and less of a joke. First of all, Jonathan Maxwell had worked with Ransom Olds, who was famously the first person to ever put a car onto an assembly line, and came up with the first truly mass-produced car, it's a curved dash Oldsmobile. So a 1910 automotive history credited Maxwell with having the unit power plant, don't ask me what that is, multiple disc clutch, and thermosiphon system of cooling with the radiator in front of the engine. So those are some pretty big innovations. Maxwells were also early adopters of the steering wheel when tillers were still very popular. When Walter Chrysler took over Maxwell, not Chrysler Corporation just yet, when Walter Chrysler took over Maxwell Motors, they had some severe problems with their new car, and they really did destroy the reputation of Maxwell. And what Chrysler's engineers did under contract, Zader, Skelton, and Breer, the three musketeers as they were called, is they went through that car and they fixed its major problems. And they called the fixed version the Good Maxwell. And that was a very good ad campaign, and it really worked. And the Maxwell became quite popular, actually outselling the Chrysler. But again, 1925 was the last year of the Maxwells. 1926, they became Chryslers, and 1928, they became Plymouths. Actually, that's not quite Jack Benny and the Maxwell. Jack Benny himself wasn't originally named Jack Benny, and he wasn't originally a comedian. He started out as a violinist. He was actually an excellent violinist. His name conflicted with another violinist whose name was already registered, and he had to change it. And then his name conflicted with another musician, and he had to change it again, and he finally chose Jack Benny, which had no conflicts with any known musicians. And he started out as a violinist. He ended up acting as a master of ceremonies who put in jokes and some self-deprecating humor in between sets. And that's how he got his radio show. It wasn't originally a comedy. It was songs with Jack Benny acting as MC in between. He hired a writer, Harry Conn, and Harry Conn quickly developed the character that we know of today as Jack Benny's, of the stingy skinflint who's a bit vain and self-absorbed. And he is relentlessly mocked by any of the characters in the studio, and he occasionally mocks them, but usually all the humor is at the expense of Jack Benny. In real life, Jack Benny was actually quite generous, quite unlike his character in pretty much every way. He was really known for his comedic timing above all else. And if you look at Johnny Carson, he modeled himself deliberately, according to Johnny Carson, on Jack Benny, as did many other comedians. So that's a very quick history of Jack Benny as well.